First I want to introduce our organization, Glacier National Park Volunteer Associates. We are an official park partner of Glacier Park, totally volunteer. We have about 140 to 160 members at this time. What do we do in the park? Whatever is needed when the park is in need of manpower. This summer we were very active in the new ticketed entry system, meeting visitors to the park and directing them to various entry stations. We man the Apgar Nature Center and the Logan Pass Nature Center, Hidden Lake viewing area, and backcountry rangers. And we assist in many of the other buildings and systems that are running in the park on an annual as-needed basis. Good evening and welcome to the first speaker series presentation for 2022, presented by Glacier National Park Volunteer Associates. We have a new format this year. Rather than being a single-time live presentation, we are going on tape, and these presentations will be available at any time after their initial release. Tonight, we have from Glacier Park, John Fraley. He is retired from the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Service and is an interim instructor at Flathead Valley Community College, written many books about historical events and people in the Flathead Valley and around Montana, and he is going to speak to us tonight about two women of Glacier Park, Libby Collins, the cattle queen of Montana, and Josephine Duty, the bootleg lady of Glacier National Park. And I'll turn this over now to John and his presentation. Thank you, John.
Well, thanks a lot, Cheryl, for having me tonight, and really appreciate all the work that you guys do in your organization. And tonight I am going to talk about two women of Glacier National Park. And you may not think of the cattle queen of Montana being associated with Glacier National Park, but she was very closely associated with it. And I'll bring that out tonight. And then the bootleg lady of Glacier Park that you may have heard of. So I'm going to talk about those two in tandem. The stories come from my book, Wild River Pioneers. This is the new edition of Wild River Pioneers that came out in June. And so we'll get right into it here. So the cattle queen of Montana, did you ever think she was in Glacier National Park? Well, she spent a lot of time in Glacier National Park, actually. And she had, it's not the 1954 fictional movie that you think of when you think of the cattle queen, that starred Barbara Stanwyck and Ronald Reagan, believe it or not, and it was in 1954. But we're talking about the actual story of the cattle queen being in Glacier Park. And her name was Elizabeth Libby Collins. She was called the cattle queen of Montana. And this, for a quick sketch of her life, you can see the different points here. She was born in Rockford, Illinois. Family moved to Iowa. They worked through different mining camps. Her brother was a freighter. He comes into the story a little later too. She ended up in Virginia City and married a gentleman there who actually was one of the vigilantes, formerly one of the vigilantes. And he presented her with a cow for her wedding present. So you can see up there, she's a very unusual person. And Nat and Libby, Nat moved to the East Front and Choteau area by the late 1870s. So she switched over to this cattle ranching efforts that she did. And as you can see here, she was called, in Choteau country, she was called the cowboy's mother. She would doctor the cowboys that fell or got hurt or whatever. And she was always kind of in the middle of the public eye. And she's prevented from accompanying her cattle to Chicago. The way she became the cattle queen, because I thought this was important to mention before we get into her Glacier Park adventures. Her husband fell ill in 1887, and so she would accompany the beeves, they called them, on the rail to Chicago. Well, that was unheard of, and it was against the rules, as you can see, of the railroad to allow a lady to accompany stock on a cattle train. Well, she petitioned the stock firm and was allowed to accompany her stock anyway. So she's a very assertive woman. And here's how she became the cattle queen. As she boarded the train from Great Falls on the station there, bound for Chicago, different stockmen and cowboys gathered on the train platform and they cheered, "Success to Auntie Collins, the cattle queen of Montana." So they dubbed her the cattle queen. That's how she got her name. So Libby and Glacier and her adventures there, this took a lot of research in the L.O. Vaught collection of Glacier National Park of historical publications. She actually had a, believe it or not, it's hard to imagine, but she had a mine all the way up McDonald Creek, almost to 50 Mountain, long ways up above McDonald Lake. And this was in 1894. So imagine this pioneering woman. And she said at one point, "Mining was in my blood." And she partnered with her brother Chan, who I told you about. And this map here shows you where her hidden treasure mine was, and it way above McDonald Lake, up in the high country there near the Continental Divide. And she also partnered with several people in the McDonald Prospect area. And as you can see, this is a gathering. If you've been to McDonald Lodge, you know how fancy it is today and so on. Well, back then, George Snyder had this glacier house, and it was kind of a gathering place. Well, this is where the cattle queen and all of her hands and mining partners gathered to drink and eat before they went up to the mine. Then you can see here, the guy with the crazy looking beard, that's Uncle Jeff. And then the two people on the front step there, that's Eddie Kruger, who you may have heard of in the McDonald area, and Bert Jesmer, the cook. And then Denny Como's in here too. But basically, Uncle Jeff was one of her partners in the mine. So now I'm going to tell you about the incident at McDonald Lake. And as you can see here, I took this shot from the aerial air before all the fires. So it's what McDonald Lake used to look like, the upper end of McDonald Lake. And way up above that, on the Continental Divide that you can see there, that's where Libby had her mine. So the characters, Libby Collins, we've talked about her, the cattle queen of Montana. Chan Smith, her brother. Frank T. McPartland. Now, Frank T. McPartland was a grouchy prospector who killed a man over an argument about the size of the state of Rhode Island, believe it or not, on the east side of the divide. He was one of her partners too. And then George Snyder was the owner of the Glacier House, and they had their meetings there and so on. So the steamer F.I. Whitney would go up and down McDonald Lake and get them that far, and then they had to use a rowboat from there to get to the head of the lake, that last quarter mile or half mile, and that's where their cabins were, and that's where they would start going up to the mine. And this is George Snyder at the helm of the F.I. Whitney, which is off to the right there. So the setting of this incident, Lake McDonald's water is so clear. I know all of you have probably seen it. And it's incredibly clear, and it's very low in nutrients and low in productivity. The drop-offs are incredibly steep. This picture here shows the mouth of Snyder Creek. And if you push off and stroke about 6 times, you're over 100 feet of water. That's how quickly it drops off. And there's a reason I'm telling you about that. So here's a depth map that was made for McDonald Lake. It averages 300 feet deep, and the maximum depth is 464 feet. And where do you think that is? Right off of Snyder's boat dock at Lake McDonald, the current Lake McDonald Lodge. It's right there. 464 feet deep between there and the upper end of McDonald Lake. It has 2 million acre feet of water, and the bottom water is 39 degrees Fahrenheit all year round. So if something sunk to the bottom, it would be very well preserved. That's a hint of what I'm going to tell you about. So George Snyder, he claimed this finest point for his 160-acre homestead in August of 1894. He had the greatest place on the lake. His original glacier house at the mouth of the creek in the head of McDonald Lake is pictured here, and this is where the cattle queen, Uncle Jeff, and her compatriots would often eat and drink and meet about the hidden treasure mine, which is what she called it. So on August 5th, and we have all this great information because of L.O. Vaught. L.O. Vaught was the historian of Glacier National Park. It's incredible. And if you go into Glacier Archives, there's tons of material called the Vaught Connection. It's V-A-U-G-H-T. And that's where I did a lot of this research, assisted by Ann Fagery, that some of you may know, who was working there at the time. So Libby, Frank, and Chan had a day-long whiskey-fueled argument at Snyder's Glacier House. They were arguing about what to do with the mine. It wasn't producing very well. Should we keep trying? What should we do? They had financiers from back in the Midwest, and they were probably, making things look a lot better than they really were to keep the money flowing. So they had this argument. I'm not sure what they decided, but they got in this little rowboat and started rowing up the bank, up the lake, to their cabins. They had cabins like, if you know right where McDonald Creek comes into the lake, there's some private cabins there. That's where they had their cabins, for their jumping off point for the mine. So Chan was in the middle of the rowboat. This isn't the actual rowboat, but it's a lot like it probably would have looked. And we had Frank in the prow, and Libby was in the stern, and Libby had a whiskey jug. So Frank demanded the jug before they got to the upper end of the lake, and he stood up in the bow, and after a struggle over the whiskey jug with Libby's brother, the rowboat overturned like this in this very cold water. And Frank panicked, and he clung to Libby's dolman cloak. Does anybody know what a dolman cloak is? It's like a really fancy duster coat, and there's a clasp on it here. And he was clinging to Libby's dolman cloak. Libby was struggling to get him away from her because he was dragging her down over this rowboat that was sinking. And so she unclasped her coat, and then she wrote later that she was in a death struggle with Frank McPartland, and she had to break away from the desperate grasp of the man, quote unquote. So Frank, now the way it was described, he was weighted down because he had heavy belts, mining picks, he had 6 shooters, and he sank like a stone to the bottom of the lake. And when you think about it, it's 400 feet deep there. So Chan and Libby held hands across the overturned rowboat and were shouting and screaming and things like that because they weren't far from the dock at Snyder's Hotel. So Snyder's people at the house heard screaming and rowed and steamed out to the rescue. They were able to load Chan on the Whitney, on the Whitney, F.I. Whitney. You know, now it's the DeSmet, if you know where that is. But they had to put ropes under the arms of the Cattle Queen and dragged her to shore because they could not get her in the boat. She weighed over 300 pounds. And so they got her to the dock, saved both of them. What you see here is a Colombian newspaper report on the drowning of Frank McPartland. And what they basically did here is they kind of whitewashed it and said that Frank was trying to swim for the bank and they were trying to help him, but he sunk. That's not really what happened. And they didn't say anything about the whiskey jug. In fact, some of the people at Snyder said that Frank McPartland actually was knocked out of the boat when Chan hit him with the oar when he was trying to get back to where the whiskey jug was. I know this sounds like a bizarre story, but this is true. And then here is L.O. Vaught's actual report on the drowning. And he goes into a lot of information there about Libby and the Cattle Queen, calls her a Calamity Jane, and just goes through the whole thing. He has, I have no reason to doubt the story, Snyder and the people at the dock told him. And so that's the story of the drowning of Frank McPartland. Now, if you go up to where the boat dock is today, and you get on the dock and look up, you'll see Stanton Peak, and you'll see Vaught. And then around Vaught, which you can't quite see, is Mount McPartland. And now you know who it was named after. Grouchy Frank McPartland. So when you think about it that way, actually Libby was a pretty big part of Glacier. And then she used to visit Glacier quite a bit, all the way up till about 1917. She died, I think, in 21. And that's the story of the Cattle Queen of Montana. And what I always talk about is you can see this slide looking across from Snyder's Dock up to the upper part of the lake. You see the water kind of moving around a little bit. And when you think about it, Frank McPartland ended up 400 feet down in the lake. He's probably still down there because when you have water that's that cold, there's no biological activity going on at the bottom of the lake. He probably sank down, hit the bottom. It's only a few millimeters of silt a year because it's a very clear lake. So probably not that far below some silt down there, his skeleton, and it's probably just looking like this. And I always love telling this story at Lake McDonald Lodge because people would, go to sleep at night and think about this, that he is actually down there. So the Cattle Queen was a big part of Montana Glacier Park, and as I mentioned, I think until about 1917, Libby would come up and visit Apgar and Belton. What an incredible pioneer. And some of the things that is why Vaught called her a Calamity Jane, you got to read The Cattle Queen of Montana. It's a book called The Cattle Queen of Montana. I think I can't remember if I borrowed mine out of the collections at Glacier or the one at County Library, but I know I had to sit right there and read it. And it's just incredibly fun. It's hilarious. This is just a list of things, if you look at this, and I won't go through the whole thing, but that she claimed in her book. One of them was she was shot in the knee by Indians, escaped by hiding in a cave, saw men burned at a stake. She was forced to run the gauntlet, charged by mountain lions, escaped from a buffalo stampede. So everything that could possibly happen happened to the Cattle Queen. So you can look through that list. And then finally, she was inducted into the Montana Cowboy Hall of Fame on May 27th, 2012, and she was given the Legacy Award because of her big contributions to cattle and being the first woman to go back to Chicago with her cattle, and then all the different things she did for the cowboys on the Shoto side of the mountains. So the next lady I'd like to talk about is the bootleg lady of Glacier Park, and she's probably been the most popular character in my book, Wild River Pioneers. In fact, if you think of putting this story together, and I'm going to tell you how I assembled the story, because she was really not known before I started on this. And I started this in 1990 is when I started trying to put her story together. And I'll tell you why. But at any rate, Josephine Duty, the bootleg lady of Glacier Park, was a very enigmatic character in Glacier. She was kind of touched by the law earlier, and she was a very hard woman in a way. This location map here shows where Josephine's homestead was. And we're going to get into that. And that was, if you're driving past West Glacier up the canyon, about 10 miles up you'll get to Nyack, and then right before you get to Nyack, you look across the Middle Fork, and she has a homestead over there, which I'll show you pictures of, that's still there and now belongs to you and me through the Glacier National Park land ownership, but it wasn't in holding for a long time. So that's where her homestead was located. This is what the old Duty homestead looked like when I first saw it in the early 1980s. And you can see it's starting to fall apart and so on, but it's still, at that time, I walked upstairs in it and everything else, and now it's fallen down. You could never do that now. So I went directly back when I saw this. I was going up to Harrison Lake and I saw that cabin. I thought, what the heck is this in Glacier Park? It was this big homestead cabin with multiple rooms and everything. And so I went and I stopped by Doris Huffines' house. Doris Huffine lived by the Silver Bullet Bar. She had the Montana Museum there. And I said, Doris, what's that big? Because she was a she was a postmistress at Nyack. She owned Stanton Creek Lodge. And it turns out I found that she knew Josephine Duty really well. And Doris said, oh, that's the Duty place. There's quite a story there. You should start looking around and trying to find it all. I can tell you about some of it. She said Josephine was originally in Colorado and, originally in Georgia, went to Colorado and so on, which we'll get into. So I checked with Doris on that, and I thought, well, if I'm going to, she said, you should research her story. So I started doing that. And I skied up to Harrison Lake in February of 1987 because I wanted to kind of get a feeling of what the isolation they must have lived in there. And you can see this gorgeous picture of Harrison Lake. And as I skied back to the cabin, I hit this branch. And I started bleeding a little bit. And I thought to myself, now I was just at Harrison Lake and there were mountain lion tracks all over the place. And now I'm bleeding. I felt like a prey item, So I skied back down, got back down, and this is what the homestead looked like in 87 in the winter. You can see it's pretty intact. And I skied around the homestead and then went into one of those, the window on the right that you see there, and then went into the homestead. And so when I came out and I skied back around it, there were mountain lion tracks that had come out of the homestead while I was in there. So they're obviously, and I'll show you pictures at the end, almost every time I've ever gone in the winter, there's been mountain lion tracks around that homestead. So I don't know about it, but I call it the mystical mountain lion. So this is a picture of Maxine Conrad, my wife Dana, and Doris Huffine. Doris is Dana's great aunt. And we're out picking huckleberries, but I told them this story about the mountain lion, and Maxine said, well, John, you can't figure this out? That's not a mountain lion, that's Josephine. No one's ever told her story. Nobody knows anything about her. She's telling you to tell her story. I said, well, okay, Maxine, I don't know what I thought of it, but I started digging into it, and I found it to be very interesting. First of all, She was born Josephine Gaines in Macon County, Georgia. And I was just looking at her death certificate the other day, and on her death certificate they say her birth date, her birth county, all that's unknown. Well, I know this because I started digging into it. She was born in 1853, maybe 1848. She might have lied about her age because she didn't want to be thought of as an older woman. She wanted to be thought of as young because she had been raised in a well-to-do family back east in Georgia, Macon County. And she came west on a wagon train to Colorado, and she may have eloped when she came west. She told Doris that she saw at the site of a massacre, a wagon trail massacre, wagon massacre. She came out. So she had trouble with the law. She lost her man, and when a woman back there loses her man and out west, she's kind of not real, well grounded and not safe. And so she became a dance hall girl in Colorado. She shot a man in self-defense, which who knows what happened there. Was it a thing gone wrong or whatever? And she fled north before the trial. She was busted out of the jail and fled north before the trial. And she ended up in McCarthyville. Now, if you know where Marias Pass is, you know where McCarthyville is. If you're going up over Marias Pass on your left, watch for the Bear Creek Ranch, and that's where McCarthyville was. And it was a lawless railroad town when the rail was built over the pass in 1889 to 1891. So that's how she ended up in Montana and there. And this picture here shows a remnant of McCarthyville about 1916. And she met Dan Duty, who worked for the railroad, but mainly he was a trapper in McCarthyville. And Dan kind of fell for her. Now, when Josephine was in McCarthyville, she called herself a dancer. So we all, I think, know what that probably means. And it was a very rowdy town. I think there was 100 deaths in its 2.5-year existence and 1 or 2 births. And the old cemetery is still around. You can find some examples of the China area they had there too, because they helped, of course, build the railroad. This is a picture of Dan Duty. He was a very well-known trapper. There's an article, I found an article in the Interlake from well over 100 years ago where he had trapped so many marten in the backcountry and came out of, he was very well known. And so Dan, what he did was, he kidnapped Josephine because he really took a liking to her. And she was hooked on opium from the Chinese workers. And so Doris said that she told her that he kind of put her over a mule and the first couple miles to get her away from McCarthyville and packed her down there, went across the Middle Fork where he was beginning to build a homestead and built a hideout cabin for her to dry out in and hide from the law, because the law would come up and try to find her because she murdered somebody and it got away before the trial. So that was always an issue. So I knew to document the story, I was going to have to find the hideout cabin. So this is a good picture of the Middle Fork. This is, maybe 10 years ago. And look how remote and beautiful and pristine it is. It doesn't look any different than it did when Dan started his homestead over there in many areas. And this is close to where you cross to go to the Duty homestead, just on the verge of the Great Bear Wilderness. So it's very remote, inaccessible, awesomely beautiful. This stream here is Harrison Creek that you can see. If you go over to see the homestead, which I encourage all of you to do, you'll cross Harrison Creek coming from downstream. The buildings on the homestead, you can see here Dan and Josephine, and you can see the Airedale dog there. They had a little attached guest house. Well, what they did is they hosted some of the railroad people, like the Lewis Hill and the Hills, on hunts and trapping and shooting grizzly bears in the park. Before and after it was a park. And so it was almost like a lodge. And if you look at it now, it was huge, the way they rebuilt it. That was after Dan died, but they rebuilt it as a lodge. You see a cutthroat trout here, and then the bull trout. They had all these resources all to themselves. There was nobody else over there. You can't find a sign of anyone else having lived over there in the 200-year history of Euro-Americans. No one had lived over there. They had it all to themselves. And marten were very valuable. Dan was a renowned marten trapper. Here's a marten, if you haven't seen one before. They hunted mountain lions. They had these Airedale dogs. And they often hosted Great Northern Railroad executives for hunting grizzly bears and mountain lions. So they were very popular with the Great Northern. You don't mess with the duties because they're special. They're protected by the folks in the Great Northern. And in fact, Dan supposedly rescued Lewis Hill from a hunting accident and brought him down to their homestead. So what kind of people do you think the Glacier Park selected as their first rangers? Rough people that knew the country. They weren't maybe the most lawful people, but they could get around. They knew the area. They knew they weren't going to just go off and get lost. And this is a list from 1910. And superintendent entered service on August 8th, 1910, Major William R. Logan. Assistant superintendent, Henry Hutchings, and you can see this list here, entered service August 8th, 1910. And then who was the next person to enter service in Glacier National Park? Daniel Doody, entered service August 12th, 1910, 2 days after the first supervisor. And then you look at the other people, William Billy Burns, Clark, Joe Cosley, they're all a bunch of outlaws. Frank Pierce, Dad Randalls, they all entered about the same time, but the only date on any of the ranger ones was Dan's. So he was one of the first rangers at Glacier Park, and his headquarters was his homestead that he had built across the river. They allowed him to keep his homestead. This is the copy of his homestead deed in 1914. So he's proving up on it. It takes 5 years to prove up, so he's proving up on this deed. And this homestead became kind of a central place for the hunt, the illegal hunting, because Glacier National Park was established when? Well, 1910 was the Park Service enabling legislation, and then the park, I think, 1916. And so he established his homestead and in the middle of Glacier National Park, and he got his deed and he signed it. Well, here's a picture of Dan's gravestone. He unfortunately died in 1921, and the way Josephine wrote it on his death certificate was, he went out to the yard to cut some wood and dropped dead. So Josephine wasn't a real person of many words. It's written on her death certificate and on Dan's death certificate. So I found all the death certificates. I mean, I've got the deeds. I have all the information to bring this all alive. As I said, it was a many, many year effort. I started in 1989 with Doris and the original story published in True West magazine and then incorporated into my first version of Wild River Pioneers, and this is the updated version with a lot of updated new things I've learned about them. All the characters in the middle fork. So the present homestead building that you saw earlier in the talk was built about 1921, right after Dan died, because they had a lot of workers that would work over there on different things. You know, they did trapping, the grizzly bear hunting, maybe some other things that weren't so above boards. Because remember that when I walked around up in there was like multiple little rooms upstairs. So this homestead building was built in 1921, and that's when Josephine really came into her own. This is her with some native trout from the Middle Fork, and she did love to fish. But what she was really known for, and here you can see a thriving moonshine business, and you can see the different barrels and tanks. This isn't actually Josephine's, but it's very similar to what she had. And it's not just, well, she might have been a bootlegger. We have a documentation, which I'll show you in a minute. The Nyack station guard's name was Jack McDonald, and he was a favorite of Josephine's. He knew about the bootlegging, and he probably helped her out, kept her protected from the law, helped her carry heavy stuff, that kind of thing. And he was a Park Service ranger. I don't want to cast aspersion to him, but let's just say that was a rumor. And this is Duty Landing. This is the river right by the homestead. And again, if anyone has a chance to raft across there, I wouldn't advise you to wade it unless the river's really low, because the river's kind of treacherous to wade there. But she had a little boat that she took back and forth across. And when the train would reach Duty Landing, it would stop. The train would stop. You know, that's very unusual that a train would actually stop for an informal landing. But that was because, you know, the duties basically were royalties for Great Northern. And she would whistle, the train would whistle how many jugs of moonshine they were going to pick up. 3 whistles from the train meant 3 jugs of moonshine. And we have this documented as well. So there's Duty's Landing. And then this interview with Bud Henderson, who's an old friend of Josephine, who's a prominent Glacier National Park, kind of a dispatcher way back then in the 20s and 30s. I'll just read this because you might not be able to read it. Hello, Bud. I want to go on the number 1 tomorrow. That's what Josephine would ask. And Bud would notify the station at Essex that the train should stop at Duty Landing on the following day. You don't do things like this normally. You know, you don't stop a whole train for one person. One time, Oley, a new dispatcher, said that he couldn't notify Essex to stop the train at Duty's Landing because nobody could stop a train like that or he would get fired. But just then, the old retired chief dispatcher at Summit came in and said he'd better do it or he will get fired. So this is the kind of power that Josephine had. Now this is a ranger's log from Saturday the 18th of February 1928. So this was no rumor about Josephine's bootlegging. And it's kind of hard to read through here, but basically it says what happened was McDonald, the ranger that often would help him, he helped Josephine. He was leaving from her place to walk back to Nyack on the trail across the river, and he met up with who? Some federal revenuers. And so he had to pretend that, you know, they said, well, we understand that this is happening within Glacier Park. This is unacceptable. Have you seen this? Lead us back. And he had to lead him back to Josephine's and had to go along with busting her. And I won't go into details, but on this particular bust, 18.5 gallons of moonshine, bunch of barrels of mash, 3 or 4 stills, jugs of moonshine along the river at Duty's Landing. She was busted. And I mean, this was a big operation. That's a big operation. And so people always would wonder where she got all the materials to make her whiskey and why it was so good. Well, that train, she could get anything she wanted from the train, right? So from the Midwest, what might she get? Corn. She could get corn. She could get other grains, rye and whatever you make whiskey with. I'm not sure what all they did with. But anyway, and so that was Saturday 18th of February in 1928. Now, in August, on the 11th in 1928, this ranger page shows things are all back to normal. McDonald's eating dinner at her place. This is the guy that helped bust her. The Park Service is tying up their horses there. They have a phone with wines and stuff that they call from Duty's house. So it was like a wink and a nod, you know. It's pretty amazing. A lot of times you hear, oh, this person was a bootlegger, but this is actual, you know, official documentation. Some of the only I know of bootlegging in the Flathead and Glacier. It's the only thing I know of about where someone's actually been busted and it's been listed in an official journal. Well, she was a bootlegger. This picture of Clyde Foley was interesting because Josephine's favorite ranger was Clyde Foley, and it kind of got me interested in him. And the Folleys were still living. His son was a ranger that I met when I was working for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks up there. And the Folleys, Ray Marie Foley, is still living in Lakeside, and worked with her a lot. And I actually, in my 1918 book, Rangers, Trappers, and Trailblazers, Clyde Foley Sr. is highly biographied in there. It was at the Paola Ranger Station, but she had her favorites. She had Clyde, and then this shows you that at the Robertsons were the people that were the Nyack residents from way back, and this shows you. This is Ma Robinson, and Josephine got to know and of course, was popular with all the people in the Nyack area. And here's a picture of Josephine late in life, and the Grubers of Great Northern Railroad fame are sitting there with her, and so she was always connected very deeply with Great Northern. They prized her highly. So Josephine fell ill, unfortunately, in 1936. She moved across the river back to where, if you know where Deer Lick Creek is and that new bridge they put in, if you're going up in Nyack Flats, she actually lived in a cabin just to the right of the highway there. And that's when my great aunt knew her, because my great aunt was the postmistress at Nyack, and for a 10-year period owned the Stanton Creek Lodge. And so when they would go to Kalispell to get groceries or whatever, they would stop and they would talk to Josephine, who lived right along that creek there, right along Deer Lick Creek. And so that's how I got a lot of the information about McCarthyville and Colorado. Nobody knew any of this if it weren't for Doris. And, you know, I started interviewing people. I interviewed like 18 different people that lived up there. And certain people would have certain stories. And in fact, well before the time that Wild River Pioneers came out, but about the time that the True West article came out or a little later, of those 18 people I interviewed, almost all of them had died. That's how tenuous it was to get the information about her. And Doris died in 1990 after she was reviewing the paper I put together on Josephine that she demanded that I do. So Josephine was calling me, I guess. But anyway, this is Josephine's death certificate. And Doris said that she got, and of course Doris was living up there at the time, and Doris said she got really sick with pneumonia. She was living with a guy named Charlie Holland, it was just a convenience thing. He was a younger guy that worked on the railroad, but he was a real bad guy. And he had convinced her to sign over her deed to the homestead. So for 7 months, he was the owner of this 160-acre homestead, but he gambled it away and went through another series of ownerships. But anyway, she got sick. It was January 15th of 1936. She was taken in on the train, and she didn't want to be moved. She told this Charlie Holland, don't move me, I'll die. I can't breathe on my right side. And it was her left side, lobar pneumonia on her left side. And I talked to Velma Goss and Tiny Powell, two of the three people that were at Josephine's funeral, and other than, you know, the official or whatever. And they both said that Charlie Holland didn't even show up. He was certifying his deed, his name on the deed at the time of the funeral, and that she had these gold earrings that they got in some mining. They got them from mining, or got somebody that did have mining, and they were very heavy. And they pulled Josephine's ears got out, and Tony Powell. You guys have heard of Ace Powell, right? Well, Tony Powell, Ace Powell's famous artist in Glacier Park. Tiny Powell was his brother, and he was a packer, and he would pack stuff to Josephine, you know, and help her out and that kind of thing. And he said when they had a viewing, I guess, with 3 or 4 people, I don't know what it was, but he said her earrings were gone. And he said that probably Charlie Holland took her earrings. So, what a lowlife. But anyway, the interesting thing about way back then is there's so few people that everybody's kind of related to everybody else's activities. The guy that signed Josephine Duty's death certificate is named Albert Brassett. Albert Brassett is the one that sewed up Betty the Trapper, who lives up Nyack farther, sewed up her finger when she got shot by her brother accidentally. And Albert Brassett was the father of Mrs. Murphy, who lived to be almost 100. And Mrs. Murphy was the last person to know Josephine personally. Actually, Betty the Trapper, though, Betty Robertson Schur, who I profiled in several of my books, and she's in this book. It's called Betty the Trapper. She went to dinner a couple times at Josephine's place across the river, like Thanksgiving dinner. So when she was a little girl, because I think she was already 12 or 14 when Josephine died. So she knew Josephine, but now there's no one left who actually has a physical connection to Josephine Duty. This is the homestead deed. Was transferred to Charlie Holland, as I said, who lost it 7 months later in a gambling thing, and which figures. So all this is based on fact. Her whole story is based on fact. And if it weren't for Doris Huffine, we wouldn't know her story. There wouldn't be a Josephine's restaurant. There wouldn't be a whiskey named after her. You know, all that kind of stuff. She's really become part of the Flathead lore. So I knew that to really document this and put a wrap on it, I had to find the hideout cabin, because the way she told the story, Doris told the story, and the Robertsons didn't know about it, but the way Doris told the story, there was that hideout cabin that Dan built for her to hide out in. First he built it to her dry out in, and then to hide out in. When the law came, I knew that if I could find that where they said it was, that was pretty much a I don't know, a sign that everything's accurate. So I went to Gordon Poliot, and this is a picture of him with a grizzly bear here. Gordon's a great guy. He was the kind of guy where if you're standing like a foot away from him, he's shouting at you. He's had a big booming voice. He was a professional boxer and light heavyweight, and he lived up at Nyack Flats. Passed away about 15 years ago maybe. So anyway, he told me how to find this, and I'll just add this in. He said, go across the river, cut straight up on the ridge, above the ridge that goes down to where the Duty Homestead is, and you'll find it right on the edge of a little high cut bank above the Middle Fork, way up there. So the first time I went, and he said, right over there, he pointed out, the first time I went, I couldn't find it. I ran into a grizzly bear about 30, 40 feet away, but I couldn't find this cabin. And then, so I went back to him about a week later, I told him I couldn't find it. He says, go right along the edge and look for that cut bank. It's right at the top of that cut bank. So I guess I had the wrong cut bank, and I went right over and I found it. It's good hour to get to it. And it was exactly how it was described. Here's a picture of it. I took a picture of it. This was 1989. And you'll see the rounds of the logs. This was not just a trapper's cabin. This was built for comfort. This was a pretty good cabin. And it was in the middle of nowhere, no water, way up high on this high bank above the Middle Fork. So it was obviously not built for a utilitarian purpose other than to hide. And so once I saw that, I thought, well, I think that kind of confirms it. So you can see that picture. Not many people have ever seen it, and now it's burned. So no one ever will again. Here's Doris at her museum, and she lived till 1990. She died in 1990 at age 89, and she died at the Brennan House. And I was working on the first version of the Josephine story. That was 32 years ago, and she was reviewing it for me on her deathbed. She died a day later, and she said, "Here's what she said to me." She said, "Well, that's about as close as we're going to get, John. We don't know everything for sure, but that's about as close as we're going to get of what happened to her and her whole story." And I'm not sure if I had even found her death certificate and stuff like that, but when she was in the Brennan House, one thing I did for Doris is I said, "Doris, what do you really want?" Because I knew her days were numbered. And this Middle Fork pioneer, she said, "John, what I really want is some McDonald's French fries and a chocolate milkshake." So I went and got her McDonald's French fries and chocolate milkshake. And I'll always love her. And in 2019, my anniversary edition of A Woman's Way West was published by Far Country, and that's the story of Doris Huffine. So some of this is in there, but that's her own story, coming from Iowa to Glacier in 1925, and she cooked for Going Sun Road crew, had all kinds of instances with bears. It's a great story at her own right. So what a link to the history of Glacier. I mean, it's incredible. So Josephine was wronged. We know that, and you can see here on your screen, you see Dan Duty's gravestone that I showed you earlier. And then what do you see on the left? You just see grass. Well, I finally figured out with Jim Korn, who's an amazing guy, the section at the cemetery, that she was buried right next to him, but she never got a headstone. She was buried there, but it's just grass. And so I said, well, we're going to fix that. And I had Pete Darling, who was the section at the Columbia Falls Cemetery, make a gravestone for her, but they said it wasn't good enough, so we had to buy a fancy gravestone. And so we went all out, and we decided to have a funeral for her. This was in 2009, I think. And the cemetery was really neat. They put the sign out, funeral duty. And we had a big, you'll see here, a gathering of people from the Park Service, Jim Korn from the museum, all kinds of media people. And we installed Josephine's gravestone right next to Dan, finally. Almost 100 years after Dan died, and got his. So you can see all the people assembled there. It was pretty neat. And there's her gravestone. Josephine Duty, October 16th, 1853 to January 16th, 1936, the bootleg lady of Glacier Park. And I gave her the 1853, although I really think she was born in 1848, based on the census that they had in Macon County, Georgia. So finally then, that land is now belongs to all of us because in 19, I think it was 2011 or 2010, I guided the Trust for Public Lands National Group down the river and over to Josephine's homestead. Chaz Cartwright, the superintendent of Glacier Park, was with us, and so was Sally Thompson of Glacier Raft. And so I took them to the building, and we toured around it. And you can see, not many people knew this, but Chaz Cartwright was an archaeologist by trade, and so I took a bunch of pictures of Josephine over there and the homestead house and everything, and we were comparing them to where we found the exact place where Josephine was standing with that Cerno trout, and you'll see that's Chaz Cartwright there with that picture. You can see how the homestead is just falling into the earth compared to what it was 30, 40 years ago. There's a picture of the homestead in 21 versus this 20 in 2010, 1921 versus 2010. And it's still holding up to some degree, but it's sinking into the earth. And there's one of her root cellars where they did grab some of the moonshine in the 20s. This is the Trust for Public Lands management staff, and what they're doing here is I led them over to where the spring was that they used to make the moonshine. And they thought that was pretty funny. And they had these bottles of Glacier Dew, which were a whiskey named after Josephine, had earlier, 5 years before or whatever. And they were pouring it into this, into the spring. And I thought, man, whew, that's strong, because I don't drink at all. And I think it might have affected me a little, because when I tried to lead them back to the homestead, I got us all lost. Here I'm leading the superintendent of Glacier Park, the national contact for Trust for Public Lands, and all these people, and we're going around in a circle. We've already been here, we're going around in a circle. Finally, I found the trail and we got back there. But I always kind of wondered if that was Josephine tricking me there. And then, as it says here, and you can see, the homestead sinks slowly into the earth. And there's been a lot of spooky things that have happened about Josephine since then, but I'll save them for another time. Thanks a lot for having me, and I just love going through this, and what great characters of Glacier Park. The history is so rich. Thank you. Okay, the question was, did Libby Collins run cattle in the park? No, not at all. She just loved the park and liked to visit it. The last sighting that I read about seeing Libby was she would bring her horses to Belton and then trail ride around in the park. But she ran cattle over by Shoto. They had a cattle ranch at Shoto. Good question. We know that Dan took her across the river somewhere around 1895. And in 1910 he actually called it a homestead, and then it proved up in 1915. So we don't really know for sure, but probably in the 20s for sure, because Dan died in 21, and they were bootlegging before Dan died. But I think she really ramped it up after he passed. Kept her for money. I don't know. But she did it at least 15 years or so, because she didn't move across the river until 1931. So at least 10 years she was bootlegging over there. And she admitted, Velma Voss told me when I interviewed her 2 months before she died in 1988, she told me that Josephine admitted to her that it was bad that she did it. If she had to do it over again, she wouldn't have done it, because it's causes a lot of pain, that kind of thing. So, but I don't know, at least 10 years. She was a bootlegger at least 10 years.